Remasters and remakes have been Square Enix's bread and butter lately, and there's been much critical acclaim. Final Fantasy VII Remake managed to capture the excitement of an unreachable game. Nier Replicant improved the original's review scores by a large margin, and you can now play almost every Final Fantasy game either on PC or modern consoles. So while Legend of Mana's remastered version may be expected, it's still exciting. It's not as beloved as other titles within the Mana series, but now it's getting another shot. Here's 5 things you need to know about Legend of Mana. Legend of Mana was released in 1999, a time of transition for those at Square Enix and the video game industry as a whole. The company had just released Final Fantasy VII and VIII, and was on board with creating more 3D RPGs for the PlayStation. But Mana remained as 2D games up until Dawn of Mana in 2006. This wasn't necessarily the plan though. They did explore ways to make it a 3D game early on, but unlike much of the rest of the industry, they were unimpressed with the capabilities of the PlayStation. It couldn't handle the amount of 3D objects that the staff wanted to include, and they struggled to make characters seem lovable with the polygons the PS1 could produce. Instead, the Final Fantasy Splinter series' iconic pixel art remained. The Mana series was created by Koichi Ishii, a legendary pixel artist at the company who'd done a lot of the artwork for early Final Fantasy games. As such, it seemed only natural that he would be in charge of designing characters for his own games. But this stopped with Legend of Mana. Ishii is someone whose work had become iconic, and so instead, he used Legend as an opportunity to give other artists a chance. This included both his collaborators as well as new hires as well, launching their careers as designers. In an interview, he said that he wanted to give the other artists the joy of seeing their own characters appear in a finished game. Writing for a Mana game can be difficult, especially when you realise that these fantasy games were established more as a world rather than a series with specific themes or ideas to go off. And Koichi Ishii is more an artist than a writer, so he often has to find others to help with the narrative. In the case of Legend, he left this up to a short story competition. Everyone had the opportunity to write up their own ideas, and then the development staff took their favourites and used them within the game as a part of a multi-storyline adventure. It's a unique way of telling a story, especially since these people weren't necessarily writers, but it was yet another way of getting more people involved in crafting the game's direction. Legend is often regarded as somewhat of the odd one out in the Mana series. It was even left out of the collection of Mana that released in 2019. This is largely due to its particular gameplay systems, particularly the landmake system that lets players structure the game world themselves. And one of the reasons it fell out of place for Mana is that it was initially an idea that Ishii had early on during Saga Frontier's development. There were other ideas that came from that game too, but on that title, he was only an associate director. But since he was the lead director on Legend, he could finally do what he wanted with these ideas. Yoko Shimomura's soundtrack work is special in that her work in the 90s is just as standout as it is today. She was mostly interested in classical fantasy-like music, but one of the projects she's most famous for is the soundtrack for Street Fighter II. But in 1993, she moved from Capcom to Square with the intent on working on fantasy games. She got that opportunity working on plenty of projects at the publisher, but the one that really stood out was Legend of Mana. At the time, she said it was the soundtrack that she felt best expressed herself, and while Ishii had sometimes odd requests, she had the freedom to fulfill those in her own way. One example of this is the opening scene, the first vocal track in a Mana game, in which she specifically sought out a Swedish singer whose voice she was entranced by, and thanks to the remaster, we're getting to experience her work all over again in high quality. Feel free to subscribe to find out more about the art and creation of Japanese pop culture.